The wind was a blade against Anawa's skin, scraping away the last of her warmth. It howled through the skeletal fingers of the pine trees, a lament for the dying sun that bled purple and orange across the serrated peaks of the mountains. Each breath was a shard of ice in her lungs. She lay curled in the hollow of a fallen log, the coarse bark a merciless cradle against her fevered cheek. The world had narrowed to this single point of suffering, the gnawing cold, the fiery throb in her leg where the wound festered, and the profound, echoing loneliness of being the last one. The memory was a splinter in her mind, the chaos, the screams, the scent of smoke and blood that had torn her world apart. They had left her for dead. Perhaps she was. Death was a patient shadow, waiting just beyond the edges of her vision, its chill a welcome promise against the agony that consumed her. Snow began to fall, not the soft, gentle flakes of winter's beginning, but hard, stinging pellets driven by the wind. They struck her face, melting against her hot skin, a final, cruel baptism. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the encroaching darkness, the numbness that crept from her fingers and toes toward her heart. It was easier to let go. Easier than remembering the faces of her mother, her brother. Easier than feeling the hope drain out of her like blood from a mortal wound. The forest was an immense, indifferent beast, and she was but a failing heartbeat within its vast, cold body. The scent of pine and wet earth was thick, the smell of her own grave. A tremor ran through her, not from the cold, but from a deeper finality. This was the end. The Great Spirit had turned its face away. Then, another scent cut through the air. Wood smoke. And something else, cured leather and man. Her eyes fluttered open. A shape stood over her, a silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It was immense, broad-shouldered, draped in furs that made it seem more bare than man. Fear, sharp and primal, lanced through the fog of her pain. A white man. One of the trappers who haunted the edges of their lands, men with eyes like chips of ice and hearts to match. She tried to push herself away, to crawl deeper into the hollow of the log, but her limbs were traitors, heavy and useless. The figure knelt. She could see his face now in the gloom, a landscape of its own, mapped with a thick, dark beard and lines etched by sun and hardship. His eyes were not cruel, she noted with a flicker of surprise. They were quiet. They assessed her with a startling lack of emotion, taking in the tattered deerskin dress, the blood-caked gash on her leg, the tremor that shook her frame. He said nothing. Words were unnecessary. Her state spoke its own desperate language. With a grunt of effort, he reached for her. Anawa flinched, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. His hands paused, hovering in the air between them for a heartbeat. Then, with a gentleness that was utterly at odds with his formidable appearance, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing more than a bundle of dry sticks. The world tilted, the tree spinning into a dark blur. Pressed against the solid wall of his chest, she could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his heart, a stark contrast to the frantic fluttering in her own. She was too weak to fight, too cold to care. As he began to walk, his long, sure strides eating up the frozen ground, Anawa surrendered to the darkness completely, her last conscious thought not of fear, but of the strange, unfamiliar warmth radiating from this silent giant who had plucked her from her own grave. Consciousness returned in fragments, like shards of a broken pot. First came the warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to seep into her very bones. It was a shocking sensation after the soul-deep chill she had accepted as her final state. Then came the scent of herbs, sharp and pungent, and the low crackle of a fire. Anawa's eyelids were heavy, glued shut with fever and exhaustion, but she forced them open. She was lying on a pallet of soft furs near a stone hearth where a healthy fire danced, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn logs of a small cabin. A coarse wool blanket, heavy and smelling faintly of pine smoke, was tucked around her. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent the room spinning. A hand, firm and large, pressed gently on her shoulder, easing her back down. It was him. The man from the forest. He sat on a low stool by the fire, watching her. He held a wooden bowl that steamed, the scent of broth now clear and savory. He offered it without a word, his expression unreadable. Fear still coiled in Anawa's belly, a cold serpent amidst the welcome warmth. She was in his power, a stranger in a strange place. Yet, his actions betrayed no malice. He had brought her here, built a fire, covered her. He was offering her sustenance. Her gaze fell to her leg. The torn deerskin had been cut away, and the angry, inflamed wound was clean, packed with a poultice of dark green leaves she recognized as yarrow, a plant for stanching blood and fighting infection. A clean strip of linen was bound around it. He had tended to her with a knowledge that surprised her. She looked back at him, her throat too dry to speak, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the dangerous white trapper with this quiet, capable caretaker. He nudged the bowl toward her again, a silent insistence. Slowly, hesitantly, she pushed herself up on her elbows. He helped her, his hand supporting her back, his touch impersonal and practical. She took the bowl. Her hands trembled so badly the broth sloshed over the rim. He did not react, simply waited with unnerving patience as she lifted it to her lips and drank. The hot liquid was life itself, chasing away the last vestiges of the deathly chill. She drank it all, the simple act exhausting her. When she was finished, he took the empty bowl and set it aside. He checked the dressing on her leg, his movements efficient and sure. He did not look at her face. It was as if she were a task to be completed, a problem to be solved. He added a log to the fire, the flames leaping up in a shower of sparks, and then returned to his stool. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the hiss and pop of the burning wood. She watched him, this man named Silas. She had heard the name spoken with fear and resentment by the men of her tribe. Silas, the lone wolf who kept to the high mountains, who traded his pelts and vanished again, speaking to no one. They said he was half mad, that he preferred the company of beasts to men. Here, in the small, warm circle of his firelight, he was simply a presence. Solid. Silent. And, for reasons she could not fathom, the instrument of her survival. The fear remained, but something else began to sprout in the barren ground of her spirit, a fragile, tentative curiosity. Why? Why had he saved her? The question hung in the quiet air, an unspoken word between two people from different worlds, thrown together by a cruel twist of fate in the heart of an unforgiving wilderness. Days bled into one another, measured not by the sun, which remained hidden behind a perpetual ceiling of grey cloud, but by the man's rhythms. Anawa learned his habits from her bed of furs. He rose before the first hint of light, the scrape of his knife sharpening a blade or the soft thud of him pulling on his boots serving as her dawn. He would check her dressing, his touch always the same, firm, impersonal, efficient, before leaving a bowl of stew or broth and a skin of fresh water within her reach. Then he would disappear into the white, silent world outside, sometimes for hours, sometimes for the entire day, returning with a brace of rabbits or a ptarmigan slung over his shoulder. The cabin was his shell, and he moved within it with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice in solitude. Every object had its place, the stack of well-oiled traps by the door, the small collection of books with worn covers on a crude shelf, the neat pile of firewood that never seemed to diminish. He was a man of profound silence. In the first week, he spoke only a single word. Seeing her struggle to sit up, her muscles weak and trembling, he had crossed the room, propped her with a rolled-up pelt, and said, easy. The word was gravelly, rough from disuse, but it was not unkind. Anawa's strength returned slowly, painfully. The fever broke, leaving her weak but clear-headed. The fire in her leg cooled to a dull ache. Soon, she was able to sit up on her own, then to stand, leaning heavily on the wall. She watched him more intently now, her gaze following him as he mended a snowshoe with gut string or scraped a pelt with a smooth, practiced motion. He seemed utterly oblivious to her scrutiny, lost in his tasks. Yet she sensed he was aware of her every movement, every shift in her breathing. It was the way a wolf is aware of the wind, not through direct attention, but through a constant, low-level hum of sensory input. One afternoon, while he was out, she limped around the small space, taking stock of her prison, or her sanctuary. She was not yet sure which it was. She ran a finger over the cover of one of his books. The letters were foreign, meaningless squiggles. She touched the handle of a cast-iron pot, the smooth, worn wood of his carving knife. These were the implements of his life, a life of stark simplicity and profound isolation. She was an intrusion, a disruption to his solitary world. The thought unsettled her. She owed him her life, but she did not understand the debt, nor what payment he might eventually expect. When he returned that evening, stamping snow from his boots, he found her sitting by the fire, stitching a tear in her deerskin dress with a bone needle and a thread she had teased from the edge of his wool blanket. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze falling on her work. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not surprise, but a kind of acknowledgement. He had brought her back from the edge of death, and now here she was, performing a simple, domestic act of repair. She was no longer just a body to be tended, she was becoming a person again. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then moved to hang his furs by the hearth to dry. The silence that fell between them that night felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, of patient and rescuer. It was the silence of two people sharing a space, a fire, a fragile, unspoken truce against the vast, hostile wilderness that surrounded them. Anawa did not know what the future held, but for the first time since the raid, she felt the stirrings of something other than fear or grief. It was a quiet, stubborn seed of will. The will to mend, to heal, to live. When the wound on her leg had closed to a puckered, red scar and she could walk without the cabin walls for support, he spoke to her again. It was morning, the air in the cabin thick with the smell of brewing chicory. "Your people," he said, his voice still rough. "Where are they?" The question was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their cohabitation. Anawa looked up from the rabbit pelt she was softening, her hand stilling. The question brought the memory of her loss rushing back, a cold tide. "The winter camp was, by the Sun River," she managed, her own voice thin, reedy. She pointed eastward. He nodded, his gaze distant, as if calculating the miles, the risk. "We'll leave in 2 days." There was no discussion. It was a statement of fact. For 2 days, they prepared. He packed dried meat and a small amount of flour into saddlebags. Anawa, using her regained strength, ground dry berries and fat into pemmican, a food for hard travel. She worked with a quiet intensity, her knowledge of her own people's ways asserting itself in his space. He watched her, his silence a form of observation she was beginning to understand. It was not judgment, but a gathering of information. He gave her a pair of fur-lined moccasins he had made, the fit surprisingly perfect. He had guessed the size of her feet. The small, practical act of care felt more intimate than any word he had yet spoken. The journey was brutal. The world outside the cabin was a study in white and grey, a vast, frozen expanse that seemed determined to leech the life from anything that moved within it. Silas led the way on his sturdy mountain horse, while Anawa followed on a smaller, shaggier pony he had kept in a lean-to behind the cabin. The wind was relentless, a physical force that pushed and tore at them. They spoke little, the cold stealing their breath. At night, he would build a lean-to against a rock outcropping, start a fire with an almost magical efficiency, and they would huddle close to its meager warmth, eating their spare meal in silence. During one of these nights, a blizzard descended, a shrieking vortex of snow and ice that blotted out the world. Silas worked frantically to secure the horses and reinforce their shelter. Anawa, without being asked, used her own blanket to help shield the animals, her hands growing numb as she held it against the gale. He saw what she was doing, and for a moment, their eyes met across the swirling snow. In that shared glance, a new understanding passed between them. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners in a desperate struggle against the elements. After 3 days of punishing travel, they found the camp. Or what was left of it. It was a place of ghosts. The skeletons of lodges stood black against the snow, their hides stripped or burned. A profound, deathly silence hung over the clearing, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. Anawa slid from her pony, her legs unsteady. This was the place. This was where her world had ended. Silas dismounted and stood a respectful distance away as she walked through the wreckage. She touched the charred pole that had been her family's lodge, her fingers tracing patterns in the soot as if she could divine the final moments of her loved ones. There were no bodies. They had been taken, or buried by the raiders or the snow. There was nothing. No one. A single, dry sob escaped her, a sound of utter desolation. She sank to her knees in the snow, the cold seeping through her leggings, a mirror of the emptiness that bloomed in her chest. She was truly alone. He did not come to her, did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply stood guard, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back, his gaze scanning the silent trees. He gave her the dignity of her grief, protecting the space around it. After a long time, when the twilight began to deepen, she rose. Her face was a mask of stoicism, her sorrow buried deep. She had found no answers here, only the confirmation of her loss. She turned to him. "There is another camp," she said, her voice flat. "My uncle's people. North." "A day's ride," he just nodded, his eyes holding hers for a fraction longer than usual. He saw the strength she was forcing into herself, the will that refused to break. Without a word, he helped her onto her pony, and they turned their backs on the dead, riding north into the gathering dark. They found the second camp nestled in a valley sheltered from the wind, plumes of smoke rising from a dozen lodges like prayer offerings to the winter sky. As they approached, two riders broke away from the camp and galloped toward them, rifles held ready. They circled Silas and Anawa, their faces hard with suspicion. "Anawa," one of the men said, his eyes wide with disbelief. "He was her cousin, Black Hawk. We thought you were gone." With the others his gaze shifted to Silas, and his face hardened again. "What is this? What are you doing with this white man?" Anawa explained, her voice low and steady, telling them of the raid, of being left for dead, of how Silas had found her and tended to her wounds. She showed them the scar on her leg. Black Hawk's suspicion did not lessen, but he gestured for them to follow. The camp received them with a mixture of shock, relief, and deep mistrust. The women embraced Anawa, weeping for her and for the family she had lost. But the men watched Silas, their eyes narrowed, their hands never far from their weapons. He was the enemy, the outsider, and the fact that he had delivered one of their own back to them only deepened the mystery and the suspicion. He stood by the horses, stoic and unmoving, letting them look, letting them judge. He did not speak unless spoken to, his answers brief and to the point. He was a rock in a river of their speculation and fear. Her uncle, Chief Gray Bear, a man whose face was a testament to a long and difficult life, summoned them both to his lodge. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of smoke and sage. The council of elders was already assembled, their faces grim. Gray Bear listened intently as Anawa recounted her story again, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Then, he turned his gaze to Silas. "You saved my niece," Gray Bear said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. Silas gave a short, clipped nod. "It was the right thing to do. You took her to your lodge. You cared for her. She lived under your roof." Again, Silas nodded. Gray Bear was silent for a long moment, the weight of his contemplation filling the lodge. The other elders murmured amongst themselves, their glances darting between the towering white man and the girl who was a ghost returned to them. "Our law is clear," Gray Bear finally said, his voice resonating with authority. "An unmarried woman cannot live under the roof of a man who is not her kin. Her honor is compromised. Even in saving her, you have created a debt that cannot be paid with goods or horses." Anawa's heart went cold. She knew the law. She had never imagined it would be applied to her, to this situation. "You are a man without a tribe," Gray Bear continued, his eyes fixed on Silas. "And she is a woman without a family to protect her. She has no father, no brother to speak for her. I speak for her now." He paused, letting his words settle in the tense air. "You have saved her body, but her place among us is now broken. To restore her honor, to restore the balance, the bond that you have forged must be made law." Anawa felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Silas. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone. He seemed to understand what was coming before the chief even spoke the words. Before the sun rises tomorrow, Grey Bear declared, his voice leaving no room for argument, you will take Anawa as your wife. You will be bound to her, and she to you. You will be her protector, her husband. This is the only way. It is the law. The words fell upon Anawa like a sentence. A cage of tradition and necessity snapping shut around her. She was to be bound to this silent stranger, this man from another world who had saved her life only to now be shackled to it. It was not a marriage. It was a binding of two solitudes, a solution born of desperation and the rigid honor of her people. She looked at Silas, searching for any reaction, any protest. But he just stood there, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the chief. He had walked into their camp to return alive, and now, it seemed, he was about to lose his own. The air before dawn was brittle with cold, so sharp it felt as if the sky might crack. A single fire burned in the center of the village, a lone point of orange against the deep indigo of the fading night. There was no celebration, no joyful gathering. This was a solemn, grim affair, witnessed only by Grey Bear and the council of elders. Anawa stood beside Silas, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe her aunt had given her. It felt like a shroud. She had not slept, her mind a maelstrom of fear and resignation. This was her fate, woven from the threads of tragedy and survival. She was a stray, and her people, in their own rigid way, were giving her a tether, a place to belong, even if it was at the side of an outsider. Silas was equally still, a mountain of a man cloaked in furs. He had not spoken a word to her since the chief's decree. What was there to say? They were prisoners of a circumstance neither had chosen. She risked a glance at his profile, etched by the firelight. Was he angry? Resentful? His face betrayed nothing. He simply stood, waiting, as if accepting a sentence long overdue. Grey Bear began to speak, his voice low and resonant, the old words of the binding ceremony falling into the cold air. He spoke of duty, of protection, of the joining of two paths into one. He spoke of the debt of life, and how this union was the payment. He held a feathered cord, dyed red for life and black for the spirit world they had both brushed against. He took Anawa's hand. Her skin was icy, her fingers stiff. Then he took Silas's hand. His was large and calloused, but surprisingly warm. He brought their hands together, her small one lost in his. The contact sent a strange jolt through her, a current of warmth in the freezing air. Grey Bear wrapped the cord around their joined wrists, knotting it tightly. The physical act of being bound to this man was jarringly real. This was it. This was irrevocable. You are now one, Grey Bear declared. His path is your path. Your people are now his people to respect. His protection is your honor. Go. Live as 1 inch the elders grunted their assent. The ceremony was over. It had taken less time than it takes for a snowflake to melt on warm skin, but it had altered the course of their lives completely. As the first pale, grey light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, they were led to their horses. The village was silent, the people watching from the entrances of their lodges, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. Anawa's aunt pressed a bundle into her hands, food, a spare blanket, a small pouch of herbs. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow Anawa understood completely. She was being sent away again, exiled by the very traditions meant to protect her. Silas mounted his horse, then reached a hand down to Anawa. She looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face. His expression was unchanged, but his eyes, in the growing light, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. Resignation? Maybe even a sliver of compassion for her, a fellow prisoner. She placed her hand in his, and he easily pulled her up to sit behind him on his great horse. As they rode out of the camp, Anawa did not look back. There was nothing left for her there. She was the wife of the white trapper, Silas. A stranger bound to a stranger. She leaned her head against his broad, fur-clad back, not for comfort, but for the simple, practical warmth it offered against the biting wind. The sun had not yet crested the mountains, but a new day had begun, and with it, a life she could not have imagined in her darkest nightmares. The journey back to the cabin was shrouded in a heavy, oppressive silence. The binding cord Grey Bear had used was tucked away in one of Silas's bags, but its phantom presence still seemed to chafe Anawa's wrist. They were husband and wife. The words were a mockery. They were two people trapped in a cage not of their making. When they arrived, the cabin felt different. It was no longer just his shelter where she had been a temporary patient. It was now supposed to be her home. Their home. The thought was so absurd it was almost painful. Silas went about his familiar routines, stabling the horses, bringing in firewood, stoking the fire. He moved with the same deliberate economy as before, but now Anawa was acutely aware of his presence in a new way. Every movement, every sound he made, was a reminder of the bond that now existed between them. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the small room, the bundle from her aunt still clutched in her hands. She was an intruder all over again, but this time with a title that gave her a right to be here, a right she didn't know how to claim. The first few days were a tense dance of avoidance in a space too small for it. They shared meals in silence, their eyes fixed on their bowls or the fire. They slept in the same room, but worlds apart, he on his bunk, she on the pallet of furs that had been her sickbed. The arrangement was a constant, unspoken acknowledgement of the chasm between them. Anawa knew she could not remain a guest, a ghost in this house. The resilience that had seen her through the loss of her family and her own brush with death began to stir again. She would not be a burden. She would not be a helpless victim of circumstance. She had been bound to this life, and so she would live it. She began to assert her presence not with words, but with actions. She took the rabbits he brought back from his traps and prepared them in the way her mother had taught her, stewing the meat with wild onions and roots she dug from beneath the snow near the stream. The first time he tasted it, he stopped, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at the stew, then at her. He said nothing, but he finished every last drop. She took the stiff, half-cured pelts he stockpiled and worked them with a scraper and the oils from the animal's brains until they were as soft and supple as river clay. It was hard, grueling work, but her hands remembered the rhythms. She brought order to the cabin's masculine chaos, organizing his supplies, mending his worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. She was carving out a space for herself, building a role. She was no longer just the woman he had saved, she was a contributor, a partner in the relentless work of survival. Silas watched her. He said little, but he noticed everything. He began leaving the best, most pliable pelts for her. He built a small, raised drying rack for her herbs near the hearth after seeing her struggle to find a dry place for them. One evening, he returned from his trapline and, without a word, handed her a small object he had carved from a piece of birchwood. It was a turtle, its shell intricately detailed. Anawa took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood. A turtle. Her namesake. The symbol of perseverance, of carrying one's home on one's back. It was a message, a recognition. It was more eloquent than any speech he could have made. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, tentative curve of her lips. He did not smile back, but the hardness in his eyes seemed to soften for just a moment. The silence between them was changing again. It was no longer a wall, but a space they could both inhabit, filled with the quiet language of shared work and mutual respect. The cage of their marriage was still there, but within it, they were beginning to find a strange, unexpected kind of freedom. Winter tightened its grip, burying the world in a deep, silent blanket of snow. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. The hunt became more difficult. The deer moved to lower, more sheltered valleys, and the rabbits grew scarce. For the first time, a new kind of fear entered the cabin, the quiet, gnawing fear of starvation. Silas grew leaner, the lines on his face deepening with worry. He pushed farther into the wilderness each day, returning late, his face etched with fatigue and often empty-handed. Anawa saw the toll it was taking on him. She rationed their dwindling supply of dried meat and flour with a miser's care, making thin, unsatisfying stews that barely kept the hunger at bay. The warmth of the fire could not fight the chill of an empty stomach. One morning, Silas took down his heaviest rifle, the one he rarely used. "Bear," he said, the single word hanging in the cold air. Saw tracks. Near the ridge. A big one, woken from its den. Anawa's blood ran cold. A hungry bear, roused from its hibernation, was one of the most dangerous creatures in the mountains. It was an act of desperation. "It is too great a risk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time she had voiced an opinion on his hunting. He looked at her, his jaw set stubbornly. "There is no other choice," he left as the weak dawn light filtered through the trees. Anawa spent the day in a state of high anxiety. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every snap of a frozen branch like a gunshot. She kept the fire roaring, a beacon against the encroaching dark. As night fell and he did not return, her fear grew into a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach. The blizzard had been a fight against nature. This was a fight against a beast, and a fight against her own powerlessness. She could not just wait. Taking a burning brand from the fire for a torch and strapping a skinning knife to her belt, she pulled on the heavy furs he had given her and stepped out into the crushing cold. She was not a hunter, but she was a skilled tracker. She followed the faint impressions of his snowshoes, her torchlight cutting a small, wavering circle in the immense darkness. The wind bit at her face, and the cold was a physical pain, but she pushed on, driven by a fear that was no longer just for herself. She found him at the base of the ridge. He was leaning against a tree, his rifle on the ground beside him. The massive, dark shape of the dead bear lay in the snow a few feet away. But Silas was not victorious. His left arm was wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked bandage, and his face was pale and slick with sweat in the torchlight. "Clawed me," he grunted, his voice strained. "Broke the bone." I think he had won the fight, had secured the meat for the rest of the winter, but at a great cost. He could barely stand. In that moment, their roles were completely reversed. He was the one who was wounded, vulnerable. She was the one who had to be strong. "Lean on me," she commanded, her voice steady and clear. Awkwardly, she got her shoulder under his good arm, taking on his weight. He was impossibly heavy, and every step was a monumental effort. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of stumbling, falling, and pushing onward through the deep snow. Anawa's muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she did not falter. She was fueled by a ferocious, protective energy she didn't know she possessed. She half dragged, half carried him back to the warmth of the hearth, their shared sanctuary. The cage had been broken open by crisis, and in its place, something new and powerful was being forged in the crucible of a desperate winter night. Inside the cabin, Anawa worked with a focused urgency. She cut away the sleeve of his shirt, her hands gentle but sure. The wound was deep, for vicious gashes from the bear's claws, and his forearm was bent at an unnatural angle. The bone was clearly broken. He watched her, his face tight with pain, a strange vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before. He was a man accustomed to absolute self-reliance, and to be so helpless was a torment greater than the physical pain. She cleaned the wound as he had once cleaned hers, using the last of their trade whiskey to sterilize it. Then, using her knowledge of healing passed down from her grandmother, she set the bone. It was a brutal, agonizing process. She had him bite down on a piece of leather as she pulled the arm straight with a sickening crunch. A low groan was the only sound he made. She fashioned a splint from 2 flat pieces of kindling and bound his arm tightly with strips of clean linen. Finally, she dressed the claw marks with the last of her healing salve and helped him lie down on his bunk. Exhausted, they were both breathing heavily in the quiet room. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, but within the cabin, a profound shift had occurred. She had saved him. The debt was balanced. "Anawa," he said, his voice raspy with pain and something else, something akin to wonder. It was the first time he had said her name with such softness. She turned from the fire, where she was making a weak broth. "Rest, Silas," she said softly. The use of his name felt natural, right? It was the first time she had spoken it aloud. She brought the broth to him and helped him drink, just as he had done for her what felt like a lifetime ago. The simple act was imbued with a new meaning, a tenderness that had been absent before. Their survival now rested squarely on her shoulders. For the next 2 weeks, she did everything. She tended the fire, cooked their meager meals, and ventured out to check the traplines he had set closer to the cabin, resetting them with clumsy but determined hands. She butchered the bear meat he had won at such a cost, smoking and drying it to last them through the winter. She was relentless, her grief and fear channeled into a powerful current of will. He watched her from his bunk, his silence no longer one of distance, but of awe. He saw not the frightened, dying girl he had found in the snow, but a woman of immense strength and resilience. He saw the partner he had been given by a law he hadn't understood. One evening, as she sat by the fire mending a moccasin, he spoke. "You should have left me," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "You did not leave me, that was different." "No," she said, her gaze steady and clear. It was not in that simple exchange, everything was laid bare. Their shared history, the balance of debt and care, the unspoken recognition of their bond. It was not a bond of love, not yet, but it was one of profound, mutual reliance and respect. It was the bond of survivors who had found in each other an anchor in a hostile world. The winter would be long, but Anawa knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that they would see the spring. Together. The silent trapper and the native girl, no longer prisoners of fate, but partners who had forged a family from the ashes of their separate, broken lives, bound not by a knotted cord, but by the quiet, unshakable strength of a shared will to live.